Hi and welcome to my channel. Firstly, let me apologise for the several weeks that it's been since my last video went up. Unfortunately, sometimes life gets in the way of being a YouTuber and I've been crazy busy with work. So, I'm back now and I'm going to congratulate Lewis, who won the giveaway Praktica L2 in the last video. Keeping with the Praktica theme, I bought a cheap Praktica L with some damage to it, and probably it was one of the dirtiest cameras that I've ever handled, and I'm going to put it right and show you exactly how. Let's get into it. When this very sad mid-70s Praktica L turned up in the post to me, I was a bit shocked. The viewfinder eyepiece had been glued back on after being clearly broken off by quite a heavy impact, and the camera wouldn't focus. And the reason why it wouldn't focus after I'd levered the glue off was that the intermediary lens that goes in behind the prism had been put in back to front. It also had super glue all over it and was in a complete mess. Luckily, I had a Praktica LLC, which you can see in the background of this picture, with a completely jammed shutter and a meter that didn't work. So I decided to take the viewfinder from that, that's the viewfinder eyepiece and the little lens that goes behind the pentaprism, and the plastic carrier which actually bolts inside the top plate, and transfer it to the Praktica L. This of course would mean taking the top plate off the Praktica L. So I got on with it. The first job was to pop out the little cover plate on the wind-on crank. Now, the first time I did this on the Praktica LLC that I was using for parts, I actually managed to mangle that little plate quite badly. You actually need a very, very fine screwdriver and a steady hand and just poke it up and pop it out. Easier said than done, but it does come out. Under that cover plate, you will find a tiny circlip on top of a little black washer. I just use the tip of a fine screwdriver to pry the circlip loose. It just comes out sideways, but it can come out with a bit of a boing and it can go flying. So be prepared to be on a surface where you can find it easily. Here's one of the few specialist tools that I use for this job. It's a cheap pin vise which I got from Amazon for about 15, maybe £20. Absolutely invaluable when you're taking lenses apart or taking cameras apart. This one's a little bit wobbly and I probably should have spent a bit more money on it, but it's earned its keep. With the locking plug out of the way, you can simply lift off the wind-on lever. It has got a black washer in the top of it that you can see there, and set that aside for when you put everything back together. Under the rewind crank, top right of the picture there is actually a black plastic collar with a couple of flats on it that goes around the wind-on lever. Careful not to lose that, it will fall out when you take the top plate off, or even if you turn the camera upside down. I set the shutter speed to 1,000th of a second, which is all the way as far around as the dial will go in one direction, and then very gently levered off the little aluminium speed indicator plate that you see between my fingers there. It's normally held on with just a little drop of a rubber solution cement, and it's really quite easy to remove. Here you see the shutter speed dial components in order that they come off from right to left. The little plug that screws down onto the shaft and holds all the components, including the, on this camera it's just a ISO speed advice dial, but it just holds that on. It's pretty self-explanatory when you take it apart. Watch out though, because there's something that's quite easy to miss. The little black plastic component, which is fourth in here, has a little raised bump which locks into a notch on the ISO dial. It's easy when you look at it, but you can miss it because it's quite small. With the dials removed, you can see exactly how filthy the camera is. I suspect either the owner was, or at least one of the owners, was a heavy smoker, because I think most of that is nicotine staining, or the camera was stored on a shelf in a room where people smoke like chimneys. Anyway, that'll all be cleaned off. First thing to do now is to attack the rewind crank and remove that. Just lock the rewind crank where it would normally lock into the top of a cassette with a small screwdriver, and then turn the rewind crank anti-clockwise until it screws off. The locking collar that you can see between my fingers there was actually rather difficult to remove. I had to use a little bit of brute force and ignorance as well as the pin vise, but I actually had to give it some wax. And you can see that it's kind of slightly mangled. Luckily I had a spare from the other camera that had come off a lot more easily, so I replaced that when I put everything back together. Now we have to remove the hot shoe assembly, and I really had not been prepared for exactly how filthy, corroded and gungy that really was going to be. Out with the soldering iron, and just to unsolder that central tag, which allows the hot shoe assembly to come free, and then I'll just take the screws out of the top plate and remove it. So off went the top plate to a bowl of hot soapy water and a small scrubbing brush to be cleaned right up, and all that horrible gungy nicotine got off it. It took a little while, but it came up really quite well. An interesting fact is that the top plate isn't, as you'd imagine, satin chromed aluminium. It's satin chromed plastic. It's quite heavyweight, but it's quite surprising. I'd imagine for its age that it probably would be aluminium, but it isn't. Now to remove the two screws that hold two clamping plates on top of the broken plastic feet from the viewfinder eyepiece. Once those came off and the lens was removed, I cleaned everything up a bit. You can see the broken pieces in the background. Yeah, quite a mess. So the little plastic lens assembly was put in the right way round, which is curved side towards the pentaprism, and then the plastic eyepiece and its little glass protective lens was put on, as you can see here, and then after that the little metal wings were screwed on to hold it all in place. And yay! On with the nice clean top plate, which actually sit on very easily, and I put the 4 screws back in. Reassembly, though a bit fiddly, was quite straightforward, just the reverse of taking it apart. I used a cocktail stick to line up the flash shoe with the small shims that are underneath it, otherwise they will fall apart and it's very, very difficult to get them to line up. I did that and then reinstalled the rewind crank and the wind on lever, and finally the shutter speed dial, which really just screws together pretty simply, It just needs held as you screw everything down so it doesn't pop apart. The aluminium shutter speed display plate I actually held on with a couple of small drops of Bison contact adhesive. I'm assuming that Bison contact adhesive is what they used to repair Bison with back in the old days. I thought I'd take the opportunity of having the camera on the bench to do the film door light seal as well. This is the only light seal that's really troublesome on this camera, and as you can see from this picture, it's pretty well had it. It's falling apart. So I used a bit of isopropyl alcohol and softened it, and then a cotton bud to clean up all the gunge where it came off. And my goodness, there was a lot. I cut a new seal, the centre part and two side pieces, from some 1.2mm sticky back foam and put them on. And that was it. The job was done. So this was how the camera looked after all that work was done. And it looked quite clean, and it didn't smell of cigarette smoke, which was quite nice. All the light seals are now intact, and it focuses properly, which of course it didn't initially. Both the donor camera and the Praktica L cost me under £15, so I have a completely intact and working Praktica L for £15, which will go on for years and years and years. So if you've enjoyed this video, perhaps you'll hit the like button. And if you've really enjoyed it and you like the rest of my content, perhaps you'll think about subscribing. I'm now back after a fairly long period of intensive work, and I'm going to be doing a lot more on this channel, and there's going to be a lot more how-to-its and all kinds of things, loads more coming up. Don't forget, you can support the channel further on my Patreon site. You can take a look at my website. The details are in the description. And until I see you again, take care of yourselves and keep taking pictures.